Right. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wirelive episode 14. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking all things cybersecurity and specifically in the context of the threats to the modern workplace. I'm joined today by an amazing guest, Mr. Dominic Kirby, Dom, as I'll affectionately refer to him for the rest of the interview. And it's been a really interesting month in the world of cybersecurity. The promise of the cloud has always been huge advantages that help make businesses more efficient, more effective, reduce cost of infrastructure, more flexibility. But security has often been the big challenge. And I think particularly in the context of modern workplace, it's been an area that's caused a lot of concern over the years, and is one of the big blockers for many years, which has started to fade away. But against that backdrop, Dom and myself and others in the industry have been cautioning everybody for some time that security really isn't being taken as seriously as it needs to be. And you can definitely protect yourself against the threats that exist, but failure to, failure to plan and implement an appropriate strategy has caused some quite interesting fallout. And there's been two very public incidents in the last month that we'll come to, with the Colonial Pipeline in the US and more recently the JD meat distribution business globally as well. But before we dive into that, let's meet Dom. Dom, say hello, introduce yourself to our fantastic listeners, and tell us a bit about you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Rob. Well, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Dom Kirby. I am coming to you from Denver, Colorado, from Pax8 here in the U.S. My role at Pax8 is I'm a manager of cloud solutions, which really means I wear a lot of hats, but primarily I lead our modern workplace team and professional services. My background, I started a managed service provider right after I left our military here. Ran that for 5 years. My MSP was extremely focused on modern workplace, and also extremely focused on sensitive, typically compliant customers in the financial and legal industries. So I have a lot of experience securing cloud-first, cloud-native environments. And then I came to Pax8 out of a desire to sort of move up channel and help take the modern workplace and expand it to more SMBs.
Fantastic. So you've been kind of in and around this sector since before people were calling it modern workplace, I suppose. That seems like
Right.
it's kind of caught on in the last few years as a way to articulate the change. How do you, from your perch, initially on the MSP side and now working in support of MSPs really with us at Pax8, how have you seen it transition in terms of businesses thinking with modern workplace? Do you think businesses are more open-minded about it now than maybe they were 8-10 years ago? What's your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at cloud in general and how far it's come in a decade, or even 6 or 7 years, it's night and day, right? If you remember, Microsoft's first attempt at this was BPOS, Business Productivity Online Suite, and it was this horrible hosted exchange thing, and it was just like everyone else's horrible hosted exchange thing. We've come so far where we can really adopt platforms in a meaningful way. And I think between the advance of technology and just the overall need for workplaces to be more nimble and more flexible has really put the whole concept of modern workplace in the spotlight. Whereas, 6-7 years ago, it was, you come to the office, 9 to 5 or whatever your hours are, and you go home and you kind of forget about it. Working at the coffee shop or being in the field is now a very common thing in just about any industry. So you really need that flexibility, and to do it at scale, cloud is really the best way.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think I hesitate and realize we should just take one step back before we take two forward and just define what modern workplace is in this context, because we're so fluent in this world. To us, it's right. Totally normal vernacular. I mean, Dom, this is your world every day, so I'll give you the opportunity to define it for us. How would you define what is modern workplace in this context?
Yeah, so it's definitely not like a hard definition. It's not a certain set of technologies. It's really more of a concept, right? And all it means is that I'm taking whatever infrastructure, IT services I have today, and I'm modernizing them. And I'm usually modernizing them in a way that does involve some form of cloud platform. And really the goal is to modernize things in a way that I can have a more nimble team, a more agile team. I can use more advanced security tools in my tool set. I can use more advanced productivity tools in my tool set and really deliver a seamless experience pretty much regardless of where my team is actually working.
So in a way, I suppose what we're saying is it's a way of articulating the evolution of IT, right? And the associated technology that supports a business. I mean, like my perspective is that there is no longer such a thing as a business that is not a technology business. I think every business is now technology enabled in some shape or form, and so the art. I think for me, modern workplace is like the articulation of the evolution of what that underpinning technology looks like that supports a business. Is that consistent with the way you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a gigantic step forward, similar to how server client networking was a gigantic step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Okay, so now everybody knows what modern workplace is, or at least knows what we think it is, which is a good start if they're going to listen to us for 45 minutes. So let's talk about the big security question, because I think that there are a number of other modern workplace considerations, which maybe we'll touch on briefly. But I think, if you think about what came before the cloud and before modern workplace, businesses had technology solutions that generally lived on site at their head office location, or certainly within buildings that they owned and controlled. They could touch their data, literally. It was there in a rack on a hard disk. They could see it. They could control access to it by hiring a security guard and buying a big lock for the door, right? It was a very different time. If you go far enough back, most internal systems weren't even necessarily internet connected. So there were very few attack vectors to access this stuff. Obviously the flip side is they were therefore much less flexible, much less agile. And so there's that interesting trade-off, isn't there, as we move into this cloud-enabled world and put everything in a kind of internet-connected context. We therefore also open it up for attack and intrusion. How do you think about security in this context? Where do you start when you're having that conversation with customers?
Yeah, I think the first thing to security in any environment is knowing what you have. Right. There's a lot of businesses out there that don't understand what sort of data they're holding on to, where that data lives, who controls it. So that's really step one to do any sort of security program. But really, I think if you look at traditional infrastructure, and I tend to call it walled garden because we use a firewall and we build a wall around all that, right? And we can protect it in some form or fashion. We transition to cloud and there is no wall, right? We're logging into it from wherever we want, on whatever we want. Given whatever security controls we put in place. So you have to pivot your mindset from understanding that securing the metal and the servers and the data centers is all taken care of. Obviously in our case, it's usually taken care of by Microsoft, who spends $1 billion a year on this, right? So they've got that covered. It's really on you to understand how your users interact with your systems and the data in there, so that you can make smart decisions around how to secure it. And that's done through a number of technologies that you really have to think out how to implement. But Microsoft has this model they like to call the three-legged stool, and I'm a big fan. And the three pillars on it are identity management, device health, and data and telemetry. So you need to understand who's accessing your data, what's accessing your data, and what they're doing. If you can understand those three things and control it, that's really a good foundation to build on.
Absolutely. And would you, let's say one of our listeners today is, maybe perhaps in a position where they are using a more traditional technology infrastructure to underpin their business. Where would you encourage somebody to start when it comes to a modern workplace journey? Do you think you can just kind of attack it without much strategic thinking and you'll probably be okay and solve security later? Or do you think this is something that really should be involved at the beginning?
No, I think, the events of the last, I think all of 2021, we've really seen a rough year in cybersecurity, and it highlights you have to be a security first culture in everything you do, from, the receptionist or your frontline workers all the way up to the C-suite. You've got to have a security first mindset. So if you're going to strategize your digital transformation and you're really going to think about modern, you've got to think about it from doing your migrations and your changes with the least amount of impact to your people possible, because you want them to have a great experience still. But you've also got to build out what your security program is going to be first, so that as you're moving your sensitive data, there's no gap in protection, right? You're moving it from one secured environment to another secured environment, because what will happen is in that short window, we saw this with Colonial, that's when you'll get hit. So you've really got to think these things out very carefully, and be methodical when you're doing big changes like this.
Yeah, and let's. I mean, you mentioned Colonial, and I think it's very topical. So let's talk a bit about what went down for people that aren't aware. So the Colonial Pipeline is a critical petroleum pipeline, fuel pipeline in the US, which I believe runs predominantly on the eastern side of the states. And maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong there. But this is the way in which gasoline for automotive use and other applications is distributed across a very large area. And due to a cyber attack, the whole pipeline was brought down, right? It was completely halted for what I think was like a week or something, and caused significant disruption. Can you add any color? Do you know any more about what went on?
Yeah, I think we're finally starting to unpack that. They had Exchange on-prem, and unfortunately, it's looking like they didn't patch for the proxy logon incident that came out, I believe a couple months ago now. It's been, that's super simple to execute remote code execution vulnerability in Exchange. Unfortunately, doesn't seem like it was patched. That's not known for sure yet, but all signs point that way. And essentially, they got in there and they used that to pivot across the network and deploy ransomware. I don't think the SCADA system themselves were impacted, which is good. That's a solid sign that there was hopefully some air gapping going on. But I think it was safety and monitoring systems that were impacted. It's no longer safe for them to push things like jet fuel, across the entire eastern seaboard. And the trickle down effect of that here in the States was massive. It was daily headline news until it was resolved, and now the investigation is daily headline news, because obviously if gas is not flowing, we all drive cars. It was a very big problem, and it also pushed jet fuel, so airlines were running low on fuel in airports. So it was a very tough situation, and one of the first very high profile impacts to public infrastructure we've seen from cyber that really hit hard.
And I think what's interesting is that arguably the Colonial Pipeline was not really running a modern workplace practice, right? They're still using on-prem Exchange. And I think actually this is often one of the sundry benefits that I think people miss when they're thinking about a cloud operating model, is that Microsoft probably do a better job of keeping their email service patched than you will, right?
Absolutely.
And so actually this is, I think, one of the reasons why software as a service has proliferated, is because you remove the maintenance and administration burden. Now, of course, you are also ceding control and potentially being part of a much more juicy target as a result of that. So you're putting a lot of trust in organizations like Microsoft when you elect to use them. But history tells us that on the whole, that is a better security posture than relying upon your own internal IT department, unfortunately. And what's your perspective on that? Do you think it stacks up, the kind of security in the cloud, because of that scale that you can take advantage of?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a pooled investment, right? We all buy into this program that is, Microsoft 365, for example. It could be Google Workspace or what have you. And as a part of that, we have the understanding that part of that revenue is going towards securing that environment. And it's through no fault of really any IT team most of the time. Like, I think missing a critical patch isn't great, but most of the time it's through no fault of the IT team. Mature security operation is a very complicated machine, right? Yeah. Microsoft has security operations centers all around the world that operate 24/7. They have some of the best threat hunters in the world that work for them, which is why they're so good at this. They can invest from our pooled investment. They can invest over $1 billion a year in that security team and infrastructure. So that's really the big difference, right? We're taking our small security program, we're integrating it with one of the largest in the world. And that pooled intelligence that Microsoft has is something we can never hope to attain, right? It's something like 6 billion signals a day that they get from Defender alone on threat intelligence. So combine that with everything else they do, they just kind of know what's going on more than we could ever hope to.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that scale is such a strength, right? And it's like as we move into this future of artificially intelligent systems, which really means systems that have machine learning built into them.
Right.
Machine learning, the fuel that powers machine learning is data. The larger the data set, the more accurate the system can be. And so, if you take something like automated threat detection, clearly an organization the scale with a product the size of Microsoft's proposition and 365 is going to have considerably more accurate and effective threat detection than any private company can ever hope to have. So if you're going to outsource the threat detection component, you might as well outsource the execution as well, is my view. And so it sort of stacks up. But it's interesting because it does seem to me like I remember 5-6 years ago, or maybe a little bit further back, it was all these events we were used to run about demystifying the cloud and what is the cloud, and it was all about like getting people just comfortable with the idea that their data might live somewhere else that they didn't on systems they didn't ultimately own.
Right.
And it sort of seems like we got past that, and it got to the point where governments were doing deals with Microsoft and Amazon and starting to sign up to use cloud platforms, and SaaS has really taken over in a big way. But I personally don't feel like security kept up with that. Would you agree? Do you think it kind of got left behind a little bit in that conversation?
In some ways, absolutely. I think the perception is that it was left behind, right? And I think we weren't doing a very good job talking about how security works. And the reason you're seeing governments and agencies and things like that buy into cloud is because there's these private-public partnerships, and we've built very comprehensive frameworks for what a truly secure multi-tenant cloud looks like, right? In the U.S., we call it FedRAMP, and there's versions of it all over the world, and they have to check all these boxes and then get audited for it to make sure that they're building infrastructure in a way that's safe. But all that gets lost, right? It's a lot of dotting T's and crossing I's and things that small businesses in particular, but really any private sector business doesn't understand and doesn't want to. Yeah. So we have to have the conversation in a more sort of friendly, sugar-coated way about what really it means when we say Microsoft is doing a lot to secure that infrastructure. But we also have to have a conversation around what you need to do. What's your piece of the puzzle to secure that? And that's a big conversation that's missing. And that's why we see, millions of user records leaked from a unprotected S3 bucket, right? That's a misconfiguration. That's not on Amazon. That's Absolutely. A misconfiguration.
Yeah, and I think Amazon are perhaps more guilty of this than Microsoft, but it's kind of true in both cases, which is they're like, look, we've got an amazing shed full of power tools. If you cut your arm off with one of them, that's on you.
Right, exactly.
And S3 is a great example of that. Incredibly powerful tool set, but pretty easy to put a record on it in a way that makes it public and fairly difficult to revoke without understanding what you're doing. And we've seen that. I mean, that is like a story that feels like it's as old as time now. Is a load of passport data in an S3 bucket or something? But So, and it's interesting, some of the research from McKinsey suggests that about 45% of online cyber attacks target small businesses, which I guess aligns with that, right? That small businesses tend to be maybe an easier target typically than larger organizations that perhaps have got more resource to put into, the security question. So, you talked about the three-legged stool model, and I think that's really interesting. If you were helping set a strategy with somebody, and going through that kind of cloud journey with them, what other tools are there out there that you really rate? Because obviously 365 is often the kind of centerpiece of the puzzle, but as we've seen with Pax8, we see a lot of demand for the other pieces round the side. Maybe you could touch on a few of those and how you sort of would fit them together for somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. So my starting spot is always Business Premium, M365 Business Premium, and I'm going to use Endpoint Manager to manage your endpoints. I'm going to use Azure to manage your identities, and I'm going to put all that together first. The biggest thing, particularly in the channels, we're probably managing tens, if not hundreds of customers, right?
Yeah.
So we need to be able to see all of that at a glance. And that's why these other tools are so great, because I think if you look at almost anything on the PAX 8 line card in particular, there's probably a Microsoft equivalent, right? But if I implement Sentinel-1 and let's say I deploy that through Endpoint Manager, I have a single dashboard where I can see every endpoint I'm protecting. I can understand what's going on there. So I'm a huge, huge fan of Sentinel-1 and their advanced detection suite. Bitdefender is also another great choice. But I want to make sure I address that endpoint. And I also want to make sure I address the most common vector for drive-by attacks and ransomware is email, right? It's a convincing email. I get emails from John Street like 3 times a week. Someone pretending to be him. So putting some sort of email gateway on the outside, again, that we can see all of our customers and environments from a heads-up view. So I'm a big fan of Proofpoint in that category, and Iron Scales to protect against those phishing attacks. And it's all about defense in depth, right? So whenever I'm thinking about a tool, I need to know where it fits in my puzzle for defense in depth and make sure that it contributes. And I need to make sure it works in my ecosystem, right? Can I report on the status of that endpoint and Endpoint Manager and make a decision in Active Directory if I'm going to let it in if it's unhealthy, right? So I want a multi-vendor security solution, but I want them to talk to each other, right? And let each other know what's going on so that I can make really automated, smart decisions about what I'm going to allow to happen in my environment. So my sort of standard stack would be Business Premium, Sentinel-1, Proofpoint, Iron Scales. And then for backup, I'm personally a fan of Dropsuite.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? How even within our own product mix that we've elected to offer, there are 3 or 4 tools that solve a very similar problem, right, in slightly different ways. And and some people like to keep it all within the Microsoft family, as you say, and others really find value in the advanced capability that some of these other tools offer. But it's interesting how you talked a lot about visibility in your assessment there, about how ultimately having that sort of single pane of glass view of what's going on across your organization and your estate, or as an MSP across all of your customers' estates, right? In that context, is very, very valuable. And I think my observation in my entire life, I suppose, as a lover of tech and certainly in my career as a technologist, is that if things are difficult, they get forgotten. And I think let's come back to the Colonial example. Why didn't that patch get applied? Well, I'm going to hazard a guess that's because nobody knew it needed to be.
Yep.
If there was an easy way every morning of someone in that team seeing a huge banner that said, "Dude, you need to patch this thing now. Right. This is urgent," in plain English, I'm sure somebody would have done it, right? So I always think like the skill in execution of these things is making them easy and accessible for people. So that things don't get forgotten, because it's often not willful blindness. It's not necessarily negligence, although maybe in setting up the system in the first place, but without those things in place. But do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like would you agree with that from what you've seen across your career?
Yeah, I think if you're going to be a security practitioner, you've got to spend time to sort of get yourself in the mix, right? Like I get an amazing amount of like security intelligence from Twitter and just following security folks on Twitter, right? Yeah. But in understanding where to go to look for Microsoft security advisories, Palo Alto or whatever vendors you're using, understand where to go to get those security advisories and figure out the best way for you to consume them, so that you can be in the know. And that's a big challenge, right? There's a lot. I would imagine someone like Colonial's running these crazy SCADA platforms that were probably written 20 years ago. Who knows if that company exists, right? We see a lot of that in this space. So it's really hard to keep on top of these things. And that's where automation comes in, right? That's where we can leverage tools and automate that busy work that would know, hey, there's this patch, you should probably do that. And I can click a button and say, yeah, go ahead and do that. And it's just going to do it for me, right? The more I can automate, the more human error I remove from the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, another nod to the why cloud as an operating model is the right answer, is because the availability issues or downtime in plain English that used to come with updates are often resolved automatically by the vendors in question. Whether they roll, load balance systems, multi-node, whatever, however it's structured up behind the scenes. Frankly, it's none of your concern, and it shouldn't need to be, because they'll solve that for you. As far as you're concerned, your users will continue to have access to the system that you're paying them for, and behind the scenes, they'll be rolling those updates through. To people like me that used to spend hours and hours and hours architecting as a solution architect how those things could be done.
Right.
I assure you all it's really complicated, but I also love that people today just don't really care or don't need to care a lot of the time about that stuff. So I suppose I'm reminiscing a little bit on how far it's come, and it's great to see how easy it has got to solve a lot of the kind of low-hanging fruit, I guess, that used to be very challenging, like the dreaded Patch Tuesday in the Microsoft world when you were running your own infrastructure. So let's look to the future a little bit. What's the direction of travel here? Do you think so? Obviously, the Biden administration this week, perhaps off the back of the Colonial issue and the JD meatpacking issue, have reprioritized the way in which cybersecurity attacks are classified to rate them alongside, terrorist attacks with explosives or other more traditional means. I think that sets a tone perhaps for the future. Personally, what's your perspective on this? Where do you think, in the context of modern workplace particularly, how do you think this evolves from here over the coming years?
Yeah, so I think overall I've been asking myself the question, I'm sure you have too, of like, when is enough going to be enough that we're going to start caring about this in a more holistic way, right?
Yeah.
And I hope we're getting to that point, right? Because we're really showing that nobody's immune, right? We've cut off fuel to the eastern seaboard. We've cut off meat to 2 continents. These are big attacks, and hospitals have been getting attacked. If the hospital's EMR isn't working, they're not serving patients. That's just how it goes down. So I think we're hopefully going to finally start to see that, hey, we really need to pay attention to this. We need to put the security guys on front stage and let them do their work. And that really flows right through to modern workplace, right? Because now we have to re-strategize if we're going to transform, which I definitely see happening. And I think COVID-19 proved the need for that. And it's obviously accelerated it by a factor of, I think, 12 is what Microsoft says. We now have to rethink how we do security. So we have to make that investment in people or partners that can help us secure that environment. And my hope is that the direction we head is, anytime we do a change like this, the first question we ask ourselves is, how do we secure it when we're there? And if we keep doing that, all of these super simple, maybe not super simple, they're not all super simple, but some of these low-hanging fruit attacks like drive-by email ransomware are just going to disappear, right? Or be greatly reduced. And the closer we can get to that, the less likely this whole criminal empire that's been built around ransomware is to grow. And that's really what we need to stop. Are these things like ransomware that are easy attacks? We're never going to stop nation states that are using APT groups to,
Sure,
right? Yeah, but these low-hanging attacks where I can go to an SMB, make a quick, 5, 10K, call it good, move on to the next. Well, now I'm doing that at scale. So these organizations are making $15-20 million a month because they'll do 1,000 attacks at once. 400 of them succeed at 10K a pop. It's just not hard to make money as a cyber criminal right now, and that's what we need to reverse.
Yeah, it's kind of it's like sort of mind bending, isn't it, when you do the maths on it and you work out what the yield is on some of these some of these attacks. I mean, and so much of it is automated. I mean, I think you make such a good point there. Like, solving for the social engineering, nation state, sophisticated 0-day exploit stuff is a different conversation.
Right.
What we're really talking about is the fairly mundane, relatively easy to protect against automated stuff, which still is remarkably effective out there. But it's funny. I mean, probably the most sophisticated manual attack I've ever seen was actually carried out against us at Wirehive. And so our domain is wirehive.com, right? And so we had, this was a few years ago now, we had a very shrewd individual who obviously had time on their hands, who was going after what appeared to be specific opportunities rather than an automated attack. They figured out that if they registered a domain which was two V's, so VVIRE Hive, it
Right.
looks almost like a W, right?
Right.
And so this person figured that out, which is quite like involved, went and bought the domain, set up a properly verified email system, cloned our signature, and then sent our accounts team a load of payment instructions from me, right, as the CEO, saying, hey, I need to pay today, like kind of that classic like scam. But because the domain looked right and it was a properly set up email system with SPF records and everything else, it, thankfully our team we're a very technically led business, and so our accounts team are pretty technical. And one of them, but it was good enough that it caused the guy to ring me up and say, I've got this email from you. You don't normally send me emails like this, so I'm not sure this is right. But actually what he didn't say was, I'm sure this is a scam, right?
Right.
And so, it's amazing how far some people will go. And I think those types of attacks are few and far between ultimately. And God knows why they were coming after us. I mean, we're not a particularly juicy target if you're watching. But I think the automated stuff is so effective still, and that's the thing that I really hope the likes of Paxay and our partners can help resolve, particularly for smaller businesses. So we fast forward then. The automated attacks are gone. The security takes a place alongside other areas of technology as a kind of first-class citizen. Do you think that eventually it becomes so integrated and automated that it falls away again a little bit as a sort of dedicated role? Or do you think actually the future is every business has a CISO on their board and like it just becomes like an absolutely critical role in all businesses? How do you think it goes? Where are we in 10 years with security roles in businesses?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think in 10 years, we're still at a point where there's a lot of sectors not taking us seriously. Just seeing the speed and the reaction of, oh, it didn't happen to me, so it won't. It's going to take a while to break that mindset, but I would love to see where, you either have a CISO and a security expert on staff, or you've outsourced that, right? You have an MSP or something to that effect that has that expertise. The majority of cybersecurity is an operational mindset and a tactical mindset, and knowing where to put the tools and how to use them, making sure you're educating the people that use the tools so that they can protect themselves. All of these things sort of come into play, and they always will, right? Security is like cops and robbers, right? It's a constant cat and mouse game of there's a better cyber criminal out there, so now we need a better security practitioner. So that'll never end, right? It'll always be a need, and we'll stop these low hanging fruit attacks, and they'll come up with the next best thing. Who knows? Maybe they find a way to inject messages into your Slack or something like that. There'll be some weird vulnerability, and we'll be back having these conversations again. So I don't think it'll ever end or stop sort of revolving.
Yeah, no doubt. Cat and mouse is a really good way of articulating it. And ultimately, technology is created by humans, and we're fallible. So
right.
Until and my experience of computer-generated systems is they're pretty fallible too for all kinds of different reasons. So it's an endless game, I suppose, in that way. And where there is reward, ultimately people will try and exploit it and
exactly
for commercial gain or otherwise. So Dom, this has been great. I think we've covered the security topic in good detail, and hopefully given our listeners a bit of context on our view of modern workplace and how clearly it is the right answer for everybody now, from governments through to small businesses, to enable effective remote working, more flexibility. The pandemic has I think really driven this evolution a little more quickly than it would have otherwise happened, and so many people have really woken up to its value now. But we've covered why security should be a consideration, and make sure you lean on your internal technology team, your MSP partner, and your vendors, really, in terms of the software that you're selecting, to make sure that their security practices are effective and that the products that you're using are going to cover your needs. Is there anything else, Dom, that we've not covered? Is there anything you'd add? Any other sort of interesting additions in the modern workplace lens?
Well, two things. I think we have a question in the chat, but I would say you have to keep researching this, right? If you decide that you want to practice security, or you want to find someone that practices security, make sure they're constantly learning. It's a constant cat and mouse game, and the threat landscape changes. We often say day by day. It's more like hour by hour, right? There's a new ransomware strain out that can evade detection this way. There's a new 0-day out that you got to get patched. So you've really got to constantly be learning, making sure you're getting the right feeds for the technology you're working with, so you really understand what actions you need to be taking every day to be a good security practitioner. I did see a question from Matt here.
Yeah, let's go to the question. So Matt kindly asks us, with Modern Workplace and BOIOD, which is bring your own device, for those not familiar, coming together, what is the consensus on securing the device? And he goes on to say, assuming all security is in place on cloud portals such as MFA, etc. He's sort of asking, do all of the various component parts of cloud security products have support for BYOD, or is there still a sort of expectation that you're managing the devices centrally? What's your perspective on this movement?
Yeah, there's a couple different answers there, and it really depends on the organization. I'm a big fan of securing all devices that are accessing corporate data, but there's different ways to go about that. So with Endpoint Manager, I can manage like a personal phone in such a way that I only manage the work data. I can't touch your personal data. I can't wipe your personal data. I can really just make sure your phone has a PIN, make sure it's up to date, and make sure that my company's data is encrypted. So I'm going to take that approach on personal mobile devices. As far as aggressiveness on workstations, I think right now, for me at least, we're still at a phase where I'd like to see corporate workstations be the norm, because I get full control of that. I know exactly everything that's configured on that at all times. Mm-hmm. And there's just, if you think about Windows or Mac, there's a million and one more things you got to think about security-wise than iOS or Android. So it's a different sort of landscape. But there's definitely organizations. We have a partner here in the US called Iconic IT, and they've implemented this internally. And any device, you can join your personal device if you want, but it's going to get their EPP installed and their EDR installed. So it really depends on how aggressive you need to be with that organization. I would say most of my customers that were somewhat compliance related, whether it be financial or legal or medical in some cases, only company devices were allowed on. And that's just, it is what it was. And then you could take your personal phone and get your email on it, so long as you enrolled it, because you need control of that device so you can make sure you can protect that data no matter where it resides.
Yeah, it's good advice. And I think, as you say, those trends seem to be fairly sector specific in terms of the nature of the data that perhaps exists within those companies. But ultimately, I suppose the summary is that the tools and systems exist now to give organizations a lot of flexibility about how they want to accommodate a bring your own device strategy. And so there is there's something out there for you if you're out there thinking about rolling it out. Again, speak to an expert, plan before you implement, but that those tools and systems do have what you would require for a kind of graded scale of compliance, I guess, on user-owned devices.
Yep, absolutely.
Great stuff. Okay, well, Dom, I think this has been a really riveting conversation on security. I do slightly wonder what will have been compromised or blown up by a cybersecurity attack next time we talk.
Right.
At some point in the future. This month it was fuel pipelines and meat distribution. Who knows what it'll be next. Hopefully nothing too impactful. Right. Any final thoughts? Anything else you'd like to add?
I think I'm good on my side, but thanks for having me. This was a blast, and I hope we do it again soon.
Yeah, me too. And to our listeners out there, if you have any follow-up questions, if you just need some help thinking about security practice, we're always happy to steer you in the right direction, whether that's working with us or perhaps introducing you to one of our many partners who specialize in security practices for businesses of all shapes and sizes. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I was Rob. This was Dom from Pax8 over in Denver, who's now going to have a lovely Friday as I knock off for the day. And yeah, thanks for watching or listening, whether you were with us live or you're listening back later. And I'll see you next time for episode 15. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.